In this presentation, I'm going to try to answer the question, can interactive fiction be used in an educational context? In order to do this, I'm going to start by looking at interactive fiction in general and how some people think it might improve learning. Then I'll dive into a specific example of where interactive fiction was used to teach German to English university students. So first of all, you might be wondering, what is interactive fiction? Well, IF is a literature-based game where the reader plays the part of a character, deciding what actions that character will take. By typing English sentences into a command prompt, the player progresses the story by telling the character where to go and how to interact with objects in the game world. And at first blush, this probably sounds a lot like a choose-your-own-adventure story. However, the interaction in IF is much more deep and complex than that. I think a better analogy is actually Myst. So in Myst, the world is not continuous, and you cannot interact with every single object. Instead, you are given discrete views into the world and very specific objects that you can interact with in those views. So I think interactive fiction is actually a lot like Myst, but without the visualizations. Let's start by looking at an example. So this is from Zork, which was written in the 80s and was probably one of the first interactive fiction games to be really popular. Any IF game, the UI is composed of basically two elements. There's the narrative, the actual story text, and then there's the command prompt where you can type in English sentences or sentence fragments in order to interact with objects in the world or move around. So let's work through an example. Alright, so when you start out the game, it says you're standing in an open field west of a white house with a boarded front door, and then there's a small mailbox here. So in order to interact with something, I need to do sort of verb-object type sentence. So I think the mailbox looks very interesting, so I'm going to say examine mailbox, and then the game responds with, this small mailbox is closed. So, and again, I'm doing the underlining here. The game doesn't really tell you what's important, but since it's closed, well, you can usually open closed things, so I say open mailbox, and the game responds with, opening the small mailbox reveals a leaflet. So naturally, I want to read a leaflet, and when I do that, it says, welcome to Zork, and has some other text. So this is the basic interaction of the game, verb-object to interact with objects. You can also move around and using cardinal directions. So if I decide to go west from here, I end up at a forest, there's trees all around, and to the east there's some sunlight. So again, I can move around by saying east. Now I'm in a forest path. And on this forest path, there's a particularly large tree with some low branches at the edge of the path. And this is an example of where you need to be sort of creative in figuring out what to interact with. You might just pass by this tree and not think much of it or try to do something different, but I thought with low branches maybe I can climb it, so I tried climb tree. And that did work. And so then I'm up a tree, and there's a bunch of text here, but kind of one thing that caught my eye was this large egg encrusted with precious jewels. And the egg is closed. So I tried my open trick, and it doesn't work. It says, you have neither the tools nor the expertise. So this is an example of a puzzle in an IF game. A lot of times you'll find objects that you can't open, like doors or, jewel-encrusted eggs or whatever. And you need to figure out, how can I use this object to solve some puzzle in some way. So for the door, you might find a hammer. For this one, I might need to find a magic spell to use or something. I don't know. But anyway, the egg seemed interesting, so I decided to take it. And then there's an inventory command, which shows me that I'm carrying around this egg and the leaflet I saw earlier. So in typical IF game, you have objects that you can carry around with you. So that's a pretty basic game, but in general, interactive fiction has a lot of variety. It ranges from very puzzle-driven games, where it's all about the puzzle and not much about the narrative, to very narrative-driven games where there's very little puzzles and it's mostly about being a player or a character in an actual story. It ranges across any literature genre, and while there's definitely crappy IF out there, there's also interactive fiction stories that have been written by Hugo and Nebula award-winning science fiction and fantasy authors, so some good stuff. But in general, any good interactive fiction is going to be written extremely well. It's going to have sort of intuitive interactions. It's coded in a way where you wouldn't say use a verb that it doesn't understand. And they all require a lot of curiosity and creativity in order to navigate this world, because it's a very open-ended world. Your goals aren't usually explicitly laid out. Or maybe you have some high-level goal, but you have no idea how to get there. Alright, so that said, how might we use interactive fiction for education? So I pulled this quote from a guy who has a website sort of proselytizing about using IF in the classroom, and he says, since 1985, I have introduced about 500 kids aged 11 through 14 to the genre. A clear majority of them like it. Students like interactive fiction mainly because it is an exciting way to read a story, a way that lets them feel very active and involved. And in general, this sort of points to the motivation, but after doing sort of a brief literature survey, there's a lot of other things that people have found uses for in the classroom for IF. An obvious one is reading comprehension and fluency. You know, you have to, in order to move around in the game and solve the puzzles, you have to understand what you're reading, including, you know, vocabulary that you may not know. You might have to look that up. And then fluency, because you're seeing the same places over and over again generally as you move around. Some people have also used it to teach elements of conventional literature, like poetic devices, character motivation, narrative, plot structure. It has been used to bring classic text to life. There were some people at University of Utah who, Utah State, who took a poem and made a game out of it. So sort of the characters in the poem, you can actually interact with them. And as I'm going to talk about next, it could also be used for sort of foreign language and vocabulary expansion.